Welcome to video number 5 in Module 309, the Class 4 driver training video. This is Chapter 6 in the manual, and it's all about skills for buses, taxis, and limousines. Passenger safety is obviously the added element when we start driving these types of vehicles. And remember that a lot of these vehicles don't have seat belts, so it's important for us to avoid sudden stops or starts. Even when people are in wheelchairs and are secured that way, again, remember that people often don't have great core strength and will be kind of jerked around and may feel almost whiplash-related injuries. Similarly, avoid abrupt turns and avoid opening or closing doors too quickly because people often do not exit the vehicle as fast as more healthy or typically mobile people. And I've actually seen quite a few incidences of people having their fingers or other parts of their body caught. Do check on your passengers frequently, and if you have a co-driver, it's a good idea to ask them to take a look as well. It can actually be a good idea to stop more often when you're driving a vehicle in our field and actually periodically go over and check on people, see if they are comfortable, see if the seatbelt is not too tight, see if they need a break. When you leave the curb, it's really important to understand that these vehicles often have a larger overhang at the back, and that overhang can swing over a sidewalk, can hit signs or pedestrians. So it's really important to make sure that you shoulder check and look for things in your vicinity. Have a good clear signal and make sure that everybody is seated if the vehicle is equipped with seat belts. So I always tell people that I will only move once their seat belts are all done up. Avoid swinging into other lanes or over sidewalks with your vehicle's tail. Remember that transit buses have the right of way anytime the road has a speed limit of less than 60. For example, as you're driving through Maple Ridge on Highway 1, that applies. If you're on a major highway, everybody has similar right of way. But when you're on basically a city street, buses have the right to come out of their bus stops before you. So if they have a signal on, you're supposed to slow down and let them come out. If that didn't happen, buses would not be able to maintain schedules or operate safely. When you're passing a parked car, make sure that you look for signs that the passenger might be exiting. For example, if the vehicle had signal lights that were on but have gone off, or a tailpipe that has recently gone off, that's evidence that a person might be getting out soon. Watch for obscured pedestrians between vehicles or vehicles that might be leaving the curb. Again, looking for things that are the opposite. A tailpipe that just got started spewing out steam, or a signal that comes on. When taking on and letting off passengers, it's really important to signal clearly to other people as you move in and out of traffic. You have to make sure that you leave 3 meters of passing space on your opposite side. Remember, you cannot pass a school bus when it's taking on or letting passengers, but other vehicles can be passed. You need to make sure that there's 85 meters of visibility for other drivers in both directions. 85 meters, to give you a reference, a Canadian football field is about 110 meters. Well, it is 110 meters from one end to the other. So it's important to think about that amount of space. So roughly at least the distance of a hockey arena. Smoking. Make sure you understand that nobody can smoke in the vehicle if there are passengers under 16. And of course, your employers won't want you to smoke in their vehicles anyways. So it's against the law for any driver in BC to smoke in a vehicle with passengers under 16, including your own vehicle with your own children. Make sure you're focused on the road. If you have to do something like collecting fares, you should do that while you're stationary. Any kind of conversation about whether or not people need help or what the directions are or whether or not you're going to be stopping where they want to stop needs to happen when the vehicle is stopped. And you may have up to 2 passengers who sit beside you if you're in a vehicle that has a bench seat, but only if they don't in any way inhibit your ability to do things like turn the steering wheel or shift gears or see out the windows or mirrors. There are no standing passengers allowed in any of the vehicles that you'll be driving. And you'll notice that they are allowed because when they're allowed, they have a specific permit on the motor carrier's license. And the same thing with those seats that fold up when somebody stands up. Those seats called jump seats are only allowed usually on transit buses. There are very few reasons why you're allowed to refuse a passenger from your vehicle. Now, of course, if you're driving a privately owned vehicle, such as by a not-for-profit society, then you don't have to stop to let just any person in. So this is referring to the idea that you're working for a company that offers transit services. If that's the case, you're only allowed to refuse the person if they will not stop smoking, if their behavior is disruptive or offensive, or you believe it is a danger to you, or if you're at maximum capacity. You're no longer allowed to refuse a person if they have an animal. That used to be the law, but it isn't anymore. And not just for assistance animals. And the reason for this is people needed to be able to take their pets to the veterinarian. So if a person has an animal that you think will be disruptive or offensive and they haven't got it under control, then that qualifies here. But you can't simply say no to them because they have an animal. And again, those let-down seats or jump seats are only possible if you have a special permit. When you're transporting disabled people, and this is pretty basic for people in our class, but there are questions about this on the ICBC Driver Services exam, make sure that you speak to the person and not to their attendant. It's really all about dignity. Don't assume that people need help before you go and actually physically assist them. Treat each passenger as an individual. Be flexible, creative, and patient if people have behavioral or emotional challenges. Make sure that any type of mobility aid, including not just wheelchairs that people are in, but things like canes or walkers, are properly secured. Because if a vehicle stops suddenly and that thing is not secured, it becomes a projectile. And make sure you give assistance animals safe space. They can become alarmed or concerned if they are crowded. It's important to give them a proper space to sit and be comfortable and safe. If you are going to operate a bus, a taxi, or a limousine in a community, you are not going to be able to proceed just with your Class 4 license. You have to get a local chauffeur's permit. You might have heard about a controversy involving the Uber program, and this was kind of an unusual circumstance because they wanted to find a regional permit for that. But currently, any other type of vehicle being driven in a specific community, you need to have a particular type of business license or chauffeur's permit to drive. You also need to make sure that there is some specific equipment if your vehicle has more than 12 passengers. Again, this includes the driver. And those passengers, and that equipment is specifically aisle lighting. There's one variation in the picture here. Another variation might be strip lights that run up and down both sides of the aisle. And these must not only be existing, but they must come on at sunset and go off at sunrise so that people can find their way through your vehicle when it's nighttime. And they should automatically come on and off when the passenger door is opened or closed. So we're talking about something like a minibus here and probably not the kind of adapted vehicle that you'll be driving. Vehicle cleanliness is also required. You're expected to mop your vehicle at a certain frequency and to use disinfectant and so forth. And if you have a motor carrier plate, you should be aware that you or your employer will be required to have routine inspections to show that you comply with the commercial vehicle safety inspection standards. You must have emergency equipment if you have 10 or more passengers. And again, I remind you that the numbers 10, 11, and 12 can get confusing. And I'd suggest that you study by having a little grid and thinking about what things happen at 10, what happens at 11, and what happens at 12. If you're driving a vehicle that has 10 or more passengers, which of course any Class 4 vehicle could be, you'll be expected to have a first aid kit on board, a spare tire, which is usually standard in most vehicles anyways, a fire extinguisher, and approved warning devices. They could be flags or flares or flashers, but something that you can put out on both sides of the vehicle on that 60-meter distance we talked about before. And all of these things must be in good working order. And if you have more than 12 passengers on your vehicle, you also have to have the additional thing of an emergency exit. It could be a window that pops out, a roof hatch, or a back door. It doesn't really matter. If you break down while you have passengers on your vehicle, it's important for you to pull over as safely as you can, end the trip, and find alternative transportation for those passengers, calling another vehicle, calling taxis, or calling people that work in the organization to come and pick them up in their own vehicles are all options. If it's really bad weather or it's not safe to be outside the vehicle, you can leave the vehicle seated on the side of the road and turned off, as long as you're not concerned about any other hazards, and have people wait there until help comes. If the vehicle itself looks like it's not safe, for example, if you're concerned about the smell of smoke and the potential for fire, you have to get off the vehicle and find some shelter. Remember, if you're fueling the vehicle, you must make sure it's turned off and turn off all electronics, not just radios, but your cell phone, for example. You cannot have any open flames. You should ground the nozzle on the spout of your vehicle, as we talked about in a previous video. But also you must remove the passengers if at all possible, and that will be definitely a standard in any organization where you'll work. It's very common for people to be gone, to be taken home at the end of an outing, and for one of the staff to say, I'm going to go and get fuel now and bring the vehicle back. If a person has baggage, there are only certain spots where they can put them. They must be stowed so that they do not become a projectile when the vehicle stops or enters an accident. They can put them under their seat if there is a bar that limits the forward movement of the baggage. And you'll see this sort of thing on airplanes or on trailways type buses, but they don't exist on every type of vehicle. The person's allowed to keep it in their lap if they're holding on to it, or it can go in a secured compartment such as the overhead rack, or if there's a trunk or there's containers underneath the seats that are secured. But they cannot just put it on the floor or in the aisle. No smoking or drinking of any kind by any person on one of these vehicles. And that includes if you're driving something like a party bus. If people are in a limousine where there's a complete partition between the driver and the passengers, that's different. But nobody can be in any area that's open to the driver. If you come across any defects, it's important that you report them promptly to the carrier. And the timing of that really has to do with whether or not the defect is one that presents an unsafe driving condition. If the vehicle can't be operated safely because of the defect, you need to report it right away, and you cannot operate the vehicle till it's fixed. If it's a minor defect, you're going to report it by the end of the day that you noticed it. Email, a text message, a phone call, a note in somebody's box, but there should be some track record that you notified the person. A school bus must comply with all of these rules and even more, even if it's a vehicle that is not typically used as a school bus. The second that it is called a school bus by, for example, a school, and often this happens by a sign being put on it, even if it's a rental or borrowed vehicle, it must have these extra things done. The brakes must be tested every day. There can be no defects at all, even small defects. No passengers can be on at all when refueling. There must be 2 signs on the vehicle stating that it is a school bus. These can be temporary, and they can be in the back and front window. There must be special mirrors that show the passengers coming on and off. You'll see these mirrors. They're usually large, convex mirrors, and they're often half of a circle, and they direct down towards the ground so that you can see where passengers are, even when they're coming around the back of your vehicle. The vehicle must have the floor mopped weekly, usually with disinfectant, and you can expect some of these to be on the test in the real life example for sure. As I said earlier, there must be 60 meters of visibility on either side of you when you drop off passengers. And people can only get off on the right side in Canada. In other words, on the passenger side of the vehicle, so that they're not getting off into traffic. And you must turn your signs off, those types of signs that move out when you're letting on passengers, after the person has finished crossing, not just when they get out of the vehicle. They have to be completely across the road. You'll also find in this section a brief portion about driving emergency vehicles, because you do need a Class 4 unrestricted license if you want to drive an ambulance as well. Remember that when you're driving these vehicles, you're only allowed to use your lights during an emergency. I know people who have these jobs and they turn their lights on so they don't have to wait at intersections, or so they can go to their coffee break faster. I see it less and less, but it's not supposed to happen. You're really technically not supposed to exceed the speed limit when you have a Class 4 license, even if you're driving an emergency vehicle. You can only do that when it's safe to do so, when you're en route to an emergency or transporting a patient from an emergency to a medical facility, and you must have both your lights and sirens on. Now, again, this isn't likely to be part of your upcoming job, but these are questions that could be on your exam. All right, I think that wraps up this particular video, and we'll move on to the next video right away.